Hey, Indian Creek 8th grade students, it's Professor Blazek, and I'm here with part 3 in our video series on World War I, looking at fighting the war. Now, the guiding question that I would like you to keep in mind as you watch this video is, why was this war so different than all those before it? Now, World War I was an incredibly deadly conflict thanks to a combination of improved fighting technology, which made conducting warfare much more effective and deadly, and also outdated battle tactics that were not designed to fight in combat that involved these new innovations, as soldiers were put into very risky situations far too often. However, as in past wars, disease was perhaps the most rampant killer, as it would claim the lives of millions during World War I. Dysentery, typhus, and cholera were especially common, and minor injuries could prove deadly if they were not treated properly because of the unsanitary fighting conditions and lack of medical innovations. So, gangrene was a common threat to the majority of wounds. Now, some of the new fighting technologies that came about in World War I were the machine gun, barbed wire, poison gas, which was first introduced by Germany, as well as the new battle vehicles of the airplane, the tank, and the submarine, which we will discuss a little bit later. Each of these innovations contributed to the massive destruction and loss of life incurred during World War I. In addition, up until this point, war was often seen as something that was actually good for nations because it created a clear distinction between the great nations of the world and the lesser nations they could wield their power over. Plus, fighting for one's country fell right in line with the common nationalist views we discussed early on in our video series. Now, at the start of the war, Germany had hoped to quickly defeat France via its attack through Belgium, which was a strategy called the Schlieffen Plan. Germany hoped to simply overwhelm France by sending multiple massive waves of troops through Western Europe, as is pictured there on the right. And this would eventually allow Germany to send its victorious troops to the east to fight in the war against Russia. However, Belgium would hold out for nearly 3 weeks, which would be enough time to allow France and Britain to organize their armies, which the Schlieffen Plan had hoped to avoid. Now, once Belgium had been defeated, Germany would continue next into France toward the capital city of Paris. And from September 5th through the 12th of 1914, the two sides, the Allies and Germany, would fight the Battle of the Marne, and British and French forces would ultimately stop the German invasion. And more than anything else, this made it clear that neither side would achieve a quick victory in the war, and this was also obviously vital to the success of the Allies, the stop of this German invasion. Now, over the next 3 years, the war's Western Front saw very little ground gained by either Germany or France and Great Britain. Instead, both sides settled into fighting via trench warfare. And in trench warfare, soldiers from both sides would fight from trenches that were dug into the ground and would occasionally cross the no man's land in between for an offensive attack. Now, trenches were constantly being dug and redug with the slightest gains or losses in land controlled, and it is estimated that 20 to 25,000 miles of trenches would be used during the entire war. Now, both sides would also line the outside of their trenches with barbed wire and sandbags, and both sides constantly shelled the opposing side's trenches with cannons or other bombs, because there was sometimes as little as 50 yards of distance between opposing trenches, just to give you an idea of what type of war was being fought on this part of the world. Now, as they battled on in the West, France pleaded with Russia to attack in the hopes that this would force Germany to pull some of its forces out of the West and into the East. Now, Russia would attack, and it had a massive army, But the army was poorly organized, and these attacks were quickly repelled. Now, in the eastern front of the war, both Germany and Austria-Hungary would launch early attacks on Russia as well, but Russia's overwhelming numbers would fight these attacks off, despite the lack of effectiveness in their own offensives. So there was really very little ground gained by either side early on in the war. Now, 1915 would see continued attacks from both the Allied and Central powers on all fronts, but there was limited ground gained by either side, continuing the theme from the first year, because counterattacks almost always pushed back any offensive strikes that were made. In other words, any ground gained was usually small and would often be lost right back to the other side. Now, the loss of life was major and far beyond any gains or losses in territory during this time. Now, the fighting conditions in the trenches during the war were awful, as soldiers would live in constant fear of shellings from cannons or poison gas attacks. And as was said before, even the smallest gains in land would come at a great cost of soldiers' lives. The trenches were also dirty, they were wet and smelled awful, and were often overrun with rats, which some soldiers wrote grew to be the size of small dogs. Soldiers had to work constantly in addition to being on guard for attacks, and their pay was minimal for the most part. However, soldiers would remain in service out of the same nationalist feelings that began the war. So there were very few who actually would desert the battlefield. Now, in addition to the fighting on land, there was also drama on the water around Europe. Great Britain would enforce a blockade of German ports early in the war, which was effective due to the size of Great Britain's massive navy. Now, this meant that many German citizens suffered from a lack of food and other supplies, contributing to the struggles of civilians during the war. Now, Germany itself would introduce the U-boat or Unterseeboot, which is a German word for submarine. And these U-boats prevented many materials from reaching Great Britain and were very effective during naval attacks as well. So this was some of the drama occurring on the seas beyond what was happening on the land. And above there is a picture of one of the German U-boats. Now, back on land on February 21st of 1916, Germany would launch an attack in the French region of Verdun. Germany believed that if enough French troops were killed in battle, eventually Germany could win out in a numbers game and defeat France. Now, Germany would gain ground early, but French counterattacks would push them back, and the battle would rage on for 303 days until December 18th. This was by far the longest battle of the war, and anywhere from 750 to 900,000 troops were killed. Now, the Allies also staged a major offensive during the year of 1916, when France and Britain launched an attack on Germany on July 1st. This battle, the Battle of the Somme, was intended to bring a faster victory to the Allies, and fighting would go on until November 18th, about 4.5 months later. In the end, the Allies would gain about 7 miles of territory, but more important than the land gained was that both sides experienced 500,000 to 600,000 casualties in this battle. Now, in other words, the battles of Verdun and the Somme saw nearly 2 million men lose their lives, and just between these two battles. And to put this in perspective, 600,000 men died in the entire American Civil War. So just an idea of just how deadly these fights were during World War I. Now, with that, we will end this video on the early fighting of World War I with a return to our guiding question. When answering it, be sure to keep in mind new technologies as well as reasons for fighting and other challenges that soldiers faced. Now, in our next video, we will be looking at how America would come to be involved in World War I. Until then, this has been Professor Blazek signing off.